Kyle Harris walked through the marketplace of Station Meridian with his toolbox in hand when he saw her stumbling between the stalls, and her hands were reaching out trying to find something solid to hold on to. And he stopped because something about the way she moved told him she could not see anything at all. And the young alien girl looked like she was maybe 14 years old by human standards, and she had the large, beautiful eyes that her species was known for. But something was very wrong with them because they were clouded over with a milky white color that blocked out everything. And Kyle watched as an older woman rushed over to guide the girl away from a stack of metal crates, and the older woman looked tired and worried. And Kyle could see the pain in her face every time she had to redirect the young girl around another obstacle. And he made a decision right there in that moment, without thinking too hard about it. He had been working on Station Meridian for 5 years now, fixing everything that broke, and there was always something breaking on a frontier station like this one where resources were limited, and people made do with whatever they had. And Kyle had learned to adapt human technology to work with all the different alien species who lived here, and he knew that not everyone could afford the fancy medical treatments available in the core systems, and he knew that sometimes the simplest solution was the one that actually helped people instead of the complicated, expensive ones that nobody could access. And he had fixed enough broken equipment to know that he could probably build something to help this girl if he tried hard enough. 3 days later, Kyle found the girl and the older woman at their small stall where they sold woven fabrics, and the colors were beautiful, even though the girl who made many of them could not see what she was creating. And Kyle approached them carefully because he did not want to seem like he was offering charity, which might offend them, and he carried a small case under his arm and he cleared his throat to get their attention. The older woman, whose name was Solara, looked at him with suspicion, and Kyle understood, because strangers did not usually approach with gifts and nothing was ever really free. And she probably thought he wanted something in return, but he just stood there holding the case and waiting. "I think I can help your granddaughter," Kyle said, and he kept his voice calm and friendly. Solara narrowed her eyes and glanced at the girl who was sitting behind the stall, running her fingers over the fabrics and feeling the textures because that was the only way she could experience them. And then Solara looked back at Kyle. "What do you want?" In return, Solara asked. Nothing, Kyle said, and he meant it, and he opened the case to show them what was inside. The device looked strange and cobbled together because that was exactly what it was, and Kyle had spent every night for 3 weeks building it from spare parts and broken equipment that he had salvaged from around the station, and it was a visor that would rest on the head and connect to the brain and allow someone to see even if their eyes did not work anymore. And the technology was not new, but making it work for this specific alien species had taken a lot of research and trial and error, and Kyle had studied their brain structure from the medical database and made sure every connection would be safe. "It is a visual prosthetic," Kyle explained, and he tried to use simple words so they would understand, and it will not fix her eyes, but it will let her see, and the sensors detect light and shapes and colors, and then send that information directly to her brain. Solara stared at the device for a long moment, and then she looked at Kyle again, and her expression had changed from suspicious to something else. And maybe it was hope. "Why would you do this for us?" she asked quietly. "Because I can," Kyle said, and it was the truth. "And because nobody should have to live in darkness when there is a way to fix it." The girl, whose name was Vena, had been listening, and she turned her head toward Kyle even though she could not see him, and she spoke for the first time. "Will it hurt?" she asked. "No," Kyle promised, "and it will feel strange at first but not painful. And if you do not like it, we can take it off immediately." Solara looked at her granddaughter and then nodded slowly, and they moved to a quieter corner of the marketplace, and Kyle carefully fitted the visor onto Vena's head, and the device rested against her skull, where her species had a natural ridge, and thin threads extended down to touch specific points on her temples, and Kyle had been very careful about those connection points because one wrong placement could cause damage instead of help. "Are you ready?" Kyle asked. Vena whispered. Kyle activated the device, and it hummed softly, and for a moment, nothing happened, and then Vena gasped and her hands flew to her face, and she touched the visor gently as if she was afraid it might disappear, and her whole body was trembling. "Vena," Kyle said softly, "and can you see anything?" She turned her head slowly from left to right, and she was looking at everything, like she had never seen the world before, and technically she had not. And tears started rolling down her face, and she started crying, but they were good tears and happy tears. "I can see," she whispered, and then louder, "and I can see grandmother, and I can see your face, and I can see the colors of the fabrics, and they are so beautiful. And I can see the lights, and I can see the people walking, and I can see everything." Solara pulled her granddaughter into a tight embrace, and she was crying too. And Kyle stood there watching them, and feeling something warm spreading through his chest, and this was why he had become an engineer in the first place, and not for the money or the prestige, but for moments like this when he could actually help someone and make their life better. "Thank you," Solara said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "And you have given her the whole world." Kyle packed up his tools quietly and let them have their moment, and Vena was still looking around at everything, and pointing at things and asking her grandmother what they were called. And Solara was laughing and crying at the same time, and answering every question. Kyle walked away feeling good about what he had done, and he thought that was the end of it, and he would go back to his normal life of fixing broken equipment and helping people in small ways. And he had no idea that he had just started something that would grow far beyond his control. And he had no idea that this one simple act of kindness would eventually tear apart an entire civilization and start a war that would last for years and change everything for millions of people. But for now, in this moment, everything was perfect, and a girl who had lived in darkness her whole life could finally see, and that was all that mattered. Word spread fast through the alien community on Station Meridian, and within 1 week Kyle had 3 more families standing outside his workshop, and they all had the same problem, and they all had family members who could not see, and the disease was common among their species, and it had something to do with their genetics and how they had evolved in the dark caves of their home planet. And now their eyes failed them more often than other species. Kyle looked at the desperate faces waiting for his help, and he knew he could not turn them away. And so he started building more visors, and each one took time, because they had to be customized for each person and their specific brain patterns. And he worked late into the night and survived on coffee and protein bars, and the only payment he accepted was the look on people's faces when they could see for the first time. But not everyone was happy about what Kyle was doing, and trouble arrived on a transport ship 2 weeks after Vena got her visor, and the trouble came in the form of a tall religious leader named High Seer Korath, who wore long robes covered in symbols and carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. Without question, Korath demanded a meeting with the station administrator, and Kyle was called to attend, and he sat in the small office while the alien religious leader paced back and forth and spoke in angry clicks and whistles that the translator turned into sharp words. "This human is interfering with sacred matters," Korath said, and he pointed at Kyle with one long finger. "And those who cannot see are blessed by the eternal darkness, and they are closer to the divine truth, and this human gives them false sight and severs their connection to what is holy." The station administrator, Linda Chen, folded her hands on her desk and looked at Korath calmly, and she had dealt with many disputes in her years running the station, and she knew how to stay neutral. "High Seer, with respect, Mr. Harris has not forced anyone to accept his help," she said, "and each person chose to wear the visor of their own free will. They were deceived." Korath snapped, and they were tempted by false promises, and now they turn away from the true path. And these devices must be destroyed, and this human must stop his interference. Kyle had been quiet until now, but he could not stay silent anymore, and he leaned forward in his chair. "They were suffering," he said, "and they could not see their families or navigate safely, or do simple tasks, and I gave them a choice they did not have before, and if that is wrong, then I do not understand your religion." Korath turned to face Kyle, and his eyes were full of anger. "And you do not need to understand human," he said, "and you only need to stop, and if you do not, then you will face consequences beyond this station." The meeting ended badly, and Korath left with his followers, but the threat hung in the air like smoke, and Kyle knew this was not over. And that night he got a message from Solara, and it made his blood run cold. "They came to our home," the message said, "and followers of the High Seer tried to take Vena's visor by force, and we refused, and they called us blasphemers and said we would be punished. And Kyle, I am afraid of what comes next." Kyle stared at the message and felt anger rising in his chest, and he had just wanted to help people, and now families were being threatened, and he did not know how to fix this problem because it was bigger than engineering, and it involved beliefs and faith, and those things could not be repaired with tools and spare parts. The next morning, protests started outside the administrative center, and aliens from both sides gathered in angry groups, and those who supported the Visors stood on one side and those who opposed them stood on the other, and security officers tried to keep them separated. But tempers were hot, and voices were raised, and it looked like violence could break out at any moment. Kyle watched from a distance and saw Vena standing with other Visor users, and she looked scared but determined. And her grandmother stood beside her, and they held hands tightly. One of the protesters from the religious side shouted at them and called them traitors, and said they had abandoned their people and their faith. Vena stepped forward, and her voice rang out clear and strong, and everyone stopped shouting. "To listen, I have not abandoned my faith," she said, "and I have not turned away from the eternal darkness, and I still believe in the sacred texts and the wisdom of our ancestors. But I also believe they would want me to see the beauty of creation, and how can I worship what I cannot witness? And my faith is stronger now, because I can see the wonders that were always hidden from me." Some in the crowd nodded and others shook their heads, and the divide was clear and growing, and Kyle realized that he had created something that went far beyond a simple medical device, and he had sparked a debate about the nature of faith itself and whether tradition should be preserved at the cost of suffering. Linda Chen appeared beside Kyle, and she looked worried. "This is escalating fast," she said quietly, "and High Seer Korath has sent messages to their home planet, and the religious council there is meeting to discuss what they call the heresy of false sight, and this could become much bigger than just our station." Kyle felt his stomach drop. "And what does that mean?" he asked. "It means," Chen said, "and that you might have just started a civil war." Kyle stared at her in shock, and he wanted to say that was impossible, and that nobody would go to war over something so simple. But he looked at the angry faces in the crowd, and the way families were turning against each other, and he knew that Chen might be right, and faith was never simple, and when people believed their souls were at stake, they would do terrible things. That night, Kyle sat alone in his workshop and looked at the Visor components scattered across his workbench, and he thought about dismantling everything and stopping production, and maybe if he stopped now, the situation would calm down and people would forget, and things would go back to normal. But then he thought about Vena and the joy on her face when she saw her grandmother for the first time, and he thought about all the others who now could navigate their lives with independence and dignity, and he knew he could not take that away from them. He had made his choice when he built the first Visor, and now he had to live with the consequences and whatever came next. Kyle would face it, but he would not abandon the people he had helped, and he would not pretend that giving sight to the blind was somehow wrong just because it challenged old beliefs. The storm was coming, and Kyle could feel it building, and all he could do was prepare and hope that somehow reason would prevail over fanaticism. The home planet of the aliens was called Kethros, and it was a world of darkness and beauty, and the surface was covered in black sand that burned under a harsh sun, but underground there were massive cave systems where entire cities had been carved from glowing stone, and the aliens had evolved there, and their eyes were made for seeing in dim light, and their whole culture was built around respecting shadows and fearing the bright sun above. In the Grand Sanctum, deep beneath the surface, the religious council called the Circle of Shadows held an emergency meeting, and High Seer Korath had returned from the station with his stories about human interference and technological heresy, and the old council members listened with growing concern, but one member of the council disagreed with Korath, and her name was Seer Valana, and she was younger than most of the others, and she had traveled widely and studied with scholars from many different species, and she had always questioned the strict interpretations of their faith and believed that the eternal darkness was a symbol for mystery and the unknown, and not a literal God demanding specific behaviors. When Korath finished his angry speech about the dangers of the Visors, Valana stood up to speak. "With respect, High Seer," she said, and her voice was calm but firm, "and I question whether we have the right to deny our people a choice. And the human did not force his technology on anyone, and he offered it, and those who were suffering chose to accept it. Korath turned to her with anger in his eyes, and the choice to embrace heresy is still heresy, he said. And the sacred texts are clear, and those born without sight are blessed and chosen to walk closer with the eternal darkness. And to give them artificial sight is to reject that blessing. Valana shook her head, and the texts were written thousands of years ago, she said, and when we had no concept of such technology, and they speak in poetry and metaphor and not literal commands. And perhaps the blessing is not blindness itself, but the strength that comes from overcoming hardship. And if technology can ease that hardship, then maybe that is also a gift. A murmur ran through the council chamber, and some members nodded thoughtfully, while others looked shocked, and the oldest member, Elder Seer Torak, slammed his staff against the stone floor. You speak dangerous words, Seer Valana, he said, and to question the texts is to question everything we are, and if we allow this, what comes next, and do we abandon all our traditions for convenience? Not convenience, Valana replied in compassion. And I have seen reports about those who wear these visors, and they do not turn away from faith, and they celebrate it, and they see the wonders of creation for the first time. And how is that blasphemy? The debate went on for hours, and then days, and then weeks, and news of the split in the council spread across Kethros and to all the colonies where their people lived, and some communities declared support for the visors and called themselves the Path of Light, and others supported the traditional beliefs and called themselves the Faithful of Shadow. Back on Station Meridian, Kyle watched everything fall apart, and peaceful protests became violent clashes, and security had to separate crowds multiple times, and people vandalized homes and businesses that supported the other side, and families stopped speaking to each other, and old friendships ended, and all because of a piece of technology that Kyle had built to help people see. Kyle tried to explain to both sides that the visors were just tools, and they had no meaning beyond what people gave them. But nobody listened anymore. And to the Path of Light, he was a hero who freed them from unnecessary suffering, and to the Faithful of Shadow, he was a demon who corrupted their people and planted doubt. One evening, Kyle was closing his workshop when someone knocked on the door, and he opened it carefully and found Vena, standing there with her visor gleaming, and behind her was Seer Valana, who had come all the way from the home planet to meet him. Mr. Harris, Valana said, and bowed her head slightly, and I am here to thank you, and also to warn you, Kyle. Let them inside and asked what the warning was about. The Circle of Shadows has issued a decree, Valana explained, and they declared the visors to be instruments of heresy, and anyone who wears them or helps create them will be cast out from our society, and, worse, there are extreme groups forming who believe violence is justified to preserve the faith. Kyle felt cold fear run through him, and violence, he said, and over a medical device. Faith is not rational, Mr. Harris, Valana said, and her face was grim. And when people believe their eternal souls are threatened, they will do terrible things to protect what they think is sacred. Vena stepped forward and spoke with determination in her voice. And I want to talk to them, she said, and to both sides, and I want to tell them that the visor has not taken my faith away, and it has made it stronger. And maybe if they hear it from one of us, they will listen. Kyle looked at the young alien girl and saw hope shining in her eyes, and he wanted to tell her it would not work and that words rarely changed minds once people had chosen sides, but he could not crush her optimism. We can try, he said. 3 days later, a big meeting was organized in the station's largest public area, and representatives from both the Path of Light and the Faithful of Shadow agreed to come, and neutral observers from other species attended too. And Station Administrator Chen ran the meeting and hoped to create dialogue that might prevent more violence. Vena stood before the crowd, and her hands shook, but her voice was steady, and she spoke about her life before the visor, and about the darkness that had been her constant companion, and the frustration and loneliness she felt. And then she spoke about the moment she first saw her grandmother's face and the joy and wonder that sight brought her. But most important, she spoke about her faith. And I have not turned away from the eternal darkness, she said, and I have found it in new ways, and I see it in the vastness of space and in the mysteries that sight reveals instead of hides, and the blessing was never blindness itself, and it was the journey and the struggle and the strength we gain from it. And now I can share that strength with others. For a moment there, Was complete silence, and then from the crowd one older alien stepped forward, and he wore the traditional robes of the faithful of shadow, and he looked at Vena for a long moment and then took out a small carved stone symbol and placed it on the ground before her. "I hear your words, young one," he said quietly, "and I do not have an answer for them, but I will think about them." It was a small gesture, but it meant something. And as the crowd dispersed, Kyle let himself hope that maybe reason could win over anger, but hope was fragile and about to be shattered. The attack happened 3 weeks after Vena's speech, and it came in the middle of the night when most people were sleeping, and the station corridors were quiet and empty, and a group of extremists from the faithful of shadow had smuggled weapons onto the station, and their plan was to destroy Kyle's workshop and every visor they could find. They did not expect anyone to fight back. Kyle was working late like he often did when the alarms started blaring, and the door to his workshop exploded inward, and 4 aliens burst through carrying plasma torches and crude weapons, and the leader was a young male named Vekros, and his eyes burned with fanatic rage. "You have poisoned our people," human Vekros snarled. "And tonight we cleanse this corruption." Kyle raised his hands, trying to stay calm even though his heart was racing. "And I do not want to fight you," he said. "And if you have problems, we can talk. And the station has people who can help mediate." "Talk?" Vekros laughed bitterly. "And we are past talking. And you made our people question the divine, and you turned children against parents and neighbors against neighbors, and you will answer for this sin." Before Vekros could move forward, another figure appeared in the doorway, and it was Vena, with a dozen other visor users behind her, and they formed a line between Kyle and the extremists. "You want to destroy the visors," Vena said coldly, "and you will have to go through us first." Vekros hesitated, and whatever he expected, it was not this. "And you would defend a human over your own people?" he asked. "I defend the right to choose," Vena replied, "and something you and your followers seem to have forgotten exists." The standoff lasted only seconds before station security arrived, led by Chief Greg. Martinez and the extremists were arrested quickly, but the damage was done and news of the attack spread fast, and it inflamed tensions everywhere, both on the station and across all the alien worlds. On Kethros, the Circle of Shadows held an emergency meeting, and High Seer Korath demanded immediate action, and he wanted all alien governments to ban the visors and make using them a crime. And Seer Valana argued just as strongly for tolerance and freedom of choice. The vote was close, but the conservatives won, and they issued a decree. And any alien who wore a visor would be exiled from the home world and stripped of citizenship, and anyone who helped make or distribute visors would face prison. The Path of Light responded immediately, and Seer Valana led them in declaring the decree illegitimate, and they began organizing what they called a government in exile, and several outer colonies where the visor movement was strong pledged their support to the Path of Light, and effectively left the traditional government. It was no longer just a religious debate, and it was a civil war. Kyle watched the news with growing horror, and ships were being turned away from Kethros if they had visor users on board, and families were being torn apart as some members chose exile over removing their visors, and on the frontier small battles were breaking out between militias from both sides. "This is my fault," Kyle said to Linda Chen as they stood in her office watching footage of a violent protest on one of the colonies. "And I built those visors, and I started all this." Chen shook her head. "And you built a tool, Kyle," she said. "And what they chose to do with it, and the meaning they gave it, that is on them. And every technology in history has caused upheaval in the printing press and the internet and genetic medicine. All of them challenged existing power and beliefs. And this is just happening faster because space makes everything closer. But people are dying," Kyle said quietly. "Yes," Chen agreed. "And they will probably keep dying until both sides realize that neither can win through force. And the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Kyle looked at her confused. "And what can I do?" he asked. "And I am just an engineer." "You are the engineer who started this," Chen said. "And you are human, and you come from a species that fought countless wars over ideology and belief, and somehow managed not to destroy yourselves. And maybe you have a perspective that they need to hear." That night, Kyle sat alone in his quarters staring at the visor schematics that had caused so much chaos. And he thought about Earth and about the religious wars and ideological conflicts that nearly ended humanity multiple times. And he thought about how those conflicts eventually ended not through one side winning but through exhaustion and compromise and the slow understanding that diversity of thought was stronger than forced uniformity. And he thought about Vena, who had risked her life to defend not just the visors but the principle they represented. Kyle opened a communication channel, and the person who answered was Sir Vallana. "I want to help," Kyle said, "and not as an engineer, but as someone who has seen this story before. And will you hear me?" Vallana looked at him through the holographic display, and her face was tired but hopeful. "And I will hear you, Mr. Harris," she said, but I cannot promise others will. That is all I can ask," Kyle replied. The next day, Kyle wrote a message that would be broadcast across all alien networks, and in it he spoke not as a scientist or inventor, but as a human who grew up learning about his species' bloody history, and he talked about wars, fought over religion, and conflicts over ideology, and how none of them were ever won by force. He spoke about coexistence and about how two people could hold opposite beliefs and still live in peace, and he spoke about the danger of letting any ideology, no matter how sacred, become an excuse for violence, and he spoke about the visors themselves, and they are not sacred, he said, and they are not cursed, and they are simply tools made of metal and circuits that give sight to those who want it, and they have no inherent meaning, and you give them meaning, and if you choose to let that meaning divide you, then the fault is not with the technology, but with yourselves. The message was viewed millions of times, and some praised it and others condemned it as arrogant lecturing from an outsider, but it did accomplish one thing, and it forced both sides to think about the human perspective and to recognize that their conflict was not unique or inevitable. It did not stop the war, but it planted a seed. The war dragged on for 2 years, and it was not a war of massive space battles or planetary destruction, but a grinding conflict of terrorism and political fights and economic pressure, and the faithful of Shadow controlled the home world, and the main religious institutions, but the Path of Light held important colonies and industrial centers, and neither side could gain a decisive advantage, and both were losing resources and lives. Kyle had stopped building visors long ago, and there were other engineers, now both human and alien, who had learned the techniques and improved the designs, and the technology had spread beyond anyone's control, and it was being made and modified across dozens of worlds. But Kyle stayed involved, and he worked with Sir Vallana and a growing group of moderates from both sides who recognized that the war could not be won by anyone, and they called themselves the Bridge, and their goal was simple, and it was to find a way for both philosophies to coexist. The breakthrough came from an unexpected person, and Elder Sir Torak, who was the oldest member of the Circle of Shadows, and one of the most conservative voices, had been watching the conflict with growing sadness, and he had lost 2 grandchildren in the fighting, and one had been on each side, and the grief forced him to question his beliefs. He reached out to Vallana through secret channels and proposed a meeting on neutral ground, and Kyle was invited to attend along with several other key figures from both sides. They met on an independent station near the border between the 2 territories, and the atmosphere was tense, with armed guards from both factions watching each other carefully. But for the first time in 2 years, leaders from both sides sat at the same table. Torak spoke first, and his voice was heavy with sorrow. "And I have buried too many of our young," he said, "and I have seen families destroyed and communities shattered, all in the name of faith, and I have come to a painful realization, and faith that demands violence is no faith at all." He looked at Vallana. "And you were right to question the rigid interpretations of our texts," he said, "and I see that now. But you were also wrong to dismiss the value of tradition and the fears of those who hold it sacred." Vallana nodded, "And I accept that," she said. "And we have been so focused on the right to choose that we have not properly addressed the concerns of those who see the visors as a threat to our cultural identity." Sir Korath, who had also been convinced to attend, spoke next, and his voice lacked its former fire, and was replaced by tired resignation. "And what do you propose?" Then he asked, "And how do we end this without one side surrendering everything?" Kyle had been silent until now, but he leaned forward and, "May I offer a suggestion?" he asked. All eyes turned to him, and he took a deep breath. "And on Earth we have a concept called pluralism," he said. and it is the idea that a society can hold multiple, even opposite belief systems as long as certain basic principles are respected and freedom of belief, and freedom from harm, and the recognition that no single ideology has a monopoly on truth. He looked around the table. And what if your civilization reformed under a new charter, he said, and one that guarantees the faithful of shadow the right to practice their traditions without interference, while also guaranteeing the path of light the right to use and develop the technology they choose, and neither side forces their beliefs on the other, and coexistence not conquest, Korath frowned. And how can we share a government with those who openly defy the sacred texts, he asked. Valana answered. And by recognizing that the texts are open to interpretation, she said, enforcing a single interpretation is tyranny, not faith. And those who wish to reject the visors are free to do so, and those who wish to embrace them are equally free, and the government stays neutral and protects both. Right, the debate continued for hours with each side, raising problems and proposing changes, but slowly and painfully, a framework began to form, and the civilization would be reorganized as a loose federation with individual worlds and colonies, having the freedom to set their own cultural policies, and the central government would focus on defense and trade and protecting basic rights, but would not enforce religious rules. It was not a perfect solution, and many extremists on both sides rejected it and called it a betrayal of their principles, but enough moderates saw it as the only path to peace and slowly support began to build. A ceasefire was declared, and it was followed by a series of negotiations that took another year to complete. And the new charter was approved by a narrow vote, and the Civil War officially ended. Kyle stood on the observation deck of Station Meridian, watching as the first joint patrol of ships from both sides passed by, and it was a symbol of the fragile peace, and beside him was Vena, who was now 17 and studying to become an engineer herself. "Do you think it will last?" she asked. Kyle shrugged. "And honestly, I do not know," he said. "And peace is always harder to maintain than war. But I think your people learned something important, and they learned that faith and progress are not enemies, and that tradition and change can coexist if people are willing to compromise." Vena smiled. "And you sound like a philosopher now," she said. "And not an engineer." Kyle laughed. "And maybe I learned something too," he said. "And that technology is never just about circuits and wires, and it is about people and the choices they make." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the stars. And then Vena spoke. "Again, and thank you, Kyle," she said, "and for giving me sight and for teaching my people that we could choose our own path." Kyle put a hand on her shoulder. "And you did that yourselves," he said. "And I just built a tool, and you decided what it meant as." The ships disappeared into the distance. Kyle thought about the past few years, and he had started with a simple act of kindness and building a device to help a blind girl see, and he could never have imagined the consequences and the conflict and suffering that followed. But he had also seen courage and compassion and the ability to change, and he had seen people on both sides recognize that their differences did not have to lead to destruction, and that there was a path forward, if they were willing to walk it together. It was not the ending he expected, but it was an ending he could live with, and that he thought was enough. Sometimes the simplest act of helping someone could change everything, and not always in ways you could predict. And sometimes change was messy and painful and required sacrifice, but in the end, if people chose understanding over hatred and coexistence over domination, then maybe all the struggle was worth it. Kyle looked at Vena standing beside him and saw the future in her eyes, and a future where the next generation would grow up in a world that valued both tradition and progress, and where faith and reason could walk side by side, and where a simple tool like a visor was just that, and a tool whose meaning came from the compassion of those who used it. And in that moment, Kyle knew that despite everything, despite the war and the pain and the loss, he would make the same choice again, because giving someone the ability to see was worth fighting for and worth believing in.